Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Little One podcast. Join the book is really good, Dressmaker, and nobody ever talks about it. I don't think we see that in the movies. Only one I can think of is the 1949 film. There's a scene in New York where we see Jo carrying her sewing basket. I have always liked that in the books that Jo is really good at sewing clothes. It's also mentioned that she likes to knit and mend clothes, which are all really good skills. My today's guest, Tiffany, is a fan of Little Woman and she makes customized 19th century clothing. She's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to historical fashion, and I have to say, I learned a lot just by talking to her. This time we are dissecting chapter Camp Lawrence, one of my personal favorites. I will add links to Tiffany's website, Stitching Addiction, if some of you want to go and see her beautiful creations. If you guys want to follow me, my handle on Instagram is podcasting Little Woman. And as always, you can find Little Woman podcast books on Amazon. You can find all the links from the description. And this is the Little Woman podcast, Jo's love for dressmaking. Enjoy! Would you like to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your relationship with Little Woman?
I am Tiffany, and I am the owner of Stitching Addiction, and I make historical fashions inspired by our favorite books and literary heroines, such as Jo March. I was raised in a very strict religious home that had a lot of expectations around women's roles. And so I could really relate to Jo during the Victorian era. And I really admired her bravery and how she challenged those different societal norms to fulfill her own dreams and pursue her own happiness. And so she was inspiration for me as I was growing up throughout my teen years. I believe the term I've heard used is a comfort character. I had no idea how many times I read Little Women in my teen years, but it was a lot. I also just fell in love with Louisa May Alcott's writing in general. And so I went to a couple of local libraries and would check out every book I could find written by Louisa May Alcott, which was mostly her children's literature. So like Rose in Bloom, and of course the entire Little Women series, and A Garland for Girls. I'm drawing a blank on some of the other titles, but every single book I could find by her, I read it.
I love Rose in Bloom so much. It's one of my comfort.
I haven't read that one since my teenage years, so now I need to go back and reread it.
I think I read Little Woman when I was 9 or something. I loved part 2 because around the time when I was in high school, I used to read part 2 a lot, and then I would identify with Amy and Jo, being a struggling artist. I think that's why Little Woman is very endearing because it doesn't really matter which time period you live, you can still relate to those same struggles that the girls go through.
Definitely. Yeah, like they're very relatable, very universal characters. I mean, all four of the sisters, because I mean, I know people who love each one of the different sisters. You know, some people, their favorite is Meg, and some love Beth, and some love Amy, and some love Jo. So they are universal characters that last throughout time.
Yeah, I think my favorite keeps changing depending on who I'm doing the research on. It's really funny. Then as a child, Beth was my favorite.
Jo has always been my favorite. I've never really changed on that, but one of my good friends loves Amy. Because for Amy, it's more of a coming of age story and how she really knows what she wants and she goes for it.
Absolutely. One of my friends kind of pointed out that Amy has almost like a Jane Austen type of quality, the way she's very witty and has snap comebacks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I love Jane Austen too, and I have a Jane Austen line as well as my Little Women line, and there's definitely some similarities between the two.
I don't know if Louisa May Alcott read Jane Austen. I know she read Emily Bronte.
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. I do not know if she read Austen or not.
Maybe we'll find out at some point.
I was going to say that's a rabbit hole that we need to go down and find whether she did or not.
Yeah. Today we are going to read the chapter Camp Lawrence and talk about historical fashion.
All right, and I will start and we'll stop out the gloves. All right. Camp Lawrence. Beth was a postmistress, for being most at home, she could attend to it regularly, and dearly liked the daily task of unlocking the little door and distributing the mail. One July day, she came in with her hands full and went about the house, leaving letters and parcels like the penny post. "Here's your posy, Mother. Laurie never forgets that," she said, putting the fresh nosegay in the vase that stood in Marmy's corner and was kept supplied by the affectionate boy. "Miss Meg March, one letter and a glove," continued Beth, delivering the articles to her sister, who sat near her mother stitching wristbands. "Why, I left a pair over there, and here is only one," said Meg, looking at the gray cotton glove. So the fashion in the era, just like the general overview, of course, was, they used the corset and the crinoline to create the hourglass shape. And contrary to popular opinion, they didn't really tight lace because there was no need for it. The crinolines could be up to 12 to 15 feet in circumference. And so the sheer width of the crinoline would make your waist look small no matter how big your waist actually was. And Queen Victoria is like a prime example of this because I don't remember off the top of my head. I want to say it was like in the 40-inch range, and she was relatively short as well. But with the crinoline fashions, she still achieved that hourglass look. However, many of the working class people, like the Marx sisters, would have worn more of a 90 to 100-inch crinoline. So a lot smaller because it's just more practical for moving around and doing things. So the gloves that they mention here, women pretty much always wore gloves when they went out. However, what's interesting about this mention is that it's a cotton glove. Most of the time they wore kitskin gloves at the time. And so I don't know if Meg had cotton gloves because it was summertime or if she's actually wearing what we would call mitts now or fingerless gloves. And so they were really popular during the era. They would end right at the knuckles. And so they would a lot of times be knitted out of silk or cotton. So it could be either type of glove that they're talking about here. Now, they did wear them when they went out, but they didn't usually wear them inside. And someone did a historical study on photographs of the era. And when they looked at extant photographs from this same time period, only about 10% of the women sitting in the photos were actually wearing gloves or mitts at the time, and the rest of them were not wearing gloves or mitts for their photographs, which was really interesting to note.
I wonder if the gloves were on more practical use then.
With the whole thing of keeping the sun off of your skin, and all of that, I think that probably had to do with it. I think they mentioned this about Laurie. I think Joe says this about Laurie, like her hands are so white and dirty, like they don't do any labor. And so that was a sign of genteelness, I guess is what you would say, upper classness. And so, if you could manage to keep your hands looking nice, then you looked well-to-do, I guess.
Yeah, I think they also mentioned that Meg was very careful with her hands.
Yes, well, she loved her gloves. You know that.
Yes. And we know also that I think John has the other glove.
Yes. It's his little memento, her close by. "Didn't you drop the other in the garden?" "No, I'm sure I didn't, for there was only one in the office." "I hate to have odd gloves. Never mind, the other may be found. My letter is only a translation of the German song I wanted. I think Mr. Brooke did it, for this isn't Laurie's writing." Mrs. March glanced at Meg, who was looking very pretty in her gingham morning gown, with the little curls blowing about her forehead, and very womanly, as she sat sewing at her little work table, full of tidy white rolls, so unconscious of the thought in her mother's mind as she sewed and sung, while her fingers flew and her thoughts were busy with girlish fancies as innocent and fresh as the pansies in her belt, that Mrs. March smiled and was satisfied. So they mentioned Meg's gingham morning gown here, and Victorian ladies had a different dress for each activity, similar to what we have today, but if you were really well-to-do, you probably changed more times than we do, you would stay. And a morning gown was usually a one-piece wrapper that opened in the front. So most of their day dresses and stuff would have been two pieces, the bodice and the skirt. But a morning gown was one piece, and it usually opened all the way down the front. And so you could just put it on, kind of like we put on a robe or whatever. That way it wouldn't mess up your hair or anything.
I went to your website. Was this one of the outfits there was? Next morning gown?
Oh, yes. I have a morning gown on my website. It is a little bit earlier than the 1860s, so before they had the wrappers, and it's not actually open all the way down the front, but it does have some of the other key elements that are seen in morning gowns. It has the lower neckline, so like they would have V-necks. They often had shorter sleeves. I didn't do shorter sleeves on that one that's on my website, but they would often have shorter sleeves on their morning gowns as well, because it was just for a woman while she was around the house. She wasn't accepting any calls at the time, and only her family was seeing her in it. So it was okay for her to show like a little bit more of her neck and chest area and her arms and all those different things.
Yeah, makes sense. And when you would be on public, you would be more modest.
Right. Exactly. When you went out, you would, have a higher neckline and the longer sleeves.
When you do historical costumes, do you make them by hand?
So I use machine sewing, but there's some finishing that's done by hand. Just the sheer amount of volume of costumes that I make, I couldn't be able to make them by hand and keep up with orders. And that would also significantly raise the price if I did everything by hand.
I bet.
I know some people that do, like some historical costumers that will do it all by hand. And I know one lady that actually sells like undergarments that are completely sewn by hand. And some people really, really love hand sewing. I prefer to do it on the machine and then just do finishing by hand. That's just what I prefer. Like I find that the most relaxing combination for myself.
I do embroidery, but it's very slow and I do it by hand, but they're not like something that I sell. I've been thinking that at some point I would make like a Little Woman embroidery book, maybe.
Yeah. That would be amazing. Yeah.
I've done a couple works inspired by Anne of Green Gables, and then I made one with like Joe's silhouette, with their flowing hair made from loose threads. I will do that at some point.
Oh, I'm sure people would love it too. People love sewing those kind of things. I know how to embroider by hand, but I generally don't do that because it's not my favorite thing to do with my time.
Yeah, I do like, I don't know how to call it in English, like loose embroidery, where you just do a sketch on the fabric and then you sew on that, like painting with threads, freestyle. It's a lot of fun.
Well, and that's one of the things they would do when they were, sitting around in the morning is they would do hand sewing. They would do some hand sewing or some reading, and they would have their breakfast. Meg is sitting here sewing in her morning gown.
2 letters for Dr. Joe, a book, and a funny old hat, which covered the whole post office stuck outside, said Beth, laughing, as she went into the study where Joe sat writing. Why, a sly fellow Laurie is. I said I wished a bigger hats were the fashion, because I burn my face every hot day, he said. Why mind the fashion? Wear a big hat and be comfortable. I said I would if I had one, and he has sent me this to try me. I'll wear it for fun and show him I don't get a fashion. And hanging the antique broad brim on a bust of Plato, Jo read the letters. One from her mother made her cheeks glow and her eyes fill, for it said to her, My dear, I write a little word to tell you with how much satisfaction I watch your efforts to control your temper. You say nothing about your trials, failures, or successes, and think, perhaps, that no one sees them but the friend whose help you daily ask, if I may trust the well-worn cover of your guidebook. I, too, have seen them all, and hardly believe in the sincerity of your resolution, since it begins to bear fruit. Go on, dear, patiently and bravely, and always believe that no one sympathizes more tenderly with you than your loving mother. That does me good. That's worth millions of money and pecks of praise. Oh, Marmee, I do try. I will keep on trying, and not get tired since I have you to help me. Laying her head on her arms, Jo wept her little romance with a few happy tears, for she had thought that no one saw and appreciated her efforts to be good. And this assurance was doubly precious, doubly encouraging, because unexpected, and from the person whose commendation she most valued. Feeling stronger than ever to meet and subdue her Apollyon, she pinned the note inside her frock as a shield and a reminder, lest she taken unaware, and proceeded to open her other letter, quite ready for either good or bad news. In a big, dashing hand, Laurie wrote, "Right. Big hats."
Yes. So at the time, the most common fashionable hats were the spoon bonnet, which is a hat that does not come very far forward on the head. It ends a little bit in front of the ears, and it has a very high brim. It was usually filled with all kinds of decorations like flowers and ribbons and things and lace. And then the other type of hat that was very common was a round hat, maybe similar to what we would call a boater today, but it would have a shallow, rounded brim instead of a squared off brim like boaters do now. And then it would have a shallow, rounded crown. I think it's a little bit later in the chapter when Marmee tells Meg not to wear her hat like off to the side. It looks very, not flirtatious, but they use a word similar to flirtatious, but that was very, very common. Like if they did wear the hats with the shallow crown and the narrow brim, they would like put them off to the side or whatever, so that, looked jaunty or whatever. And so that's not doing any good to cover your face. The hat that Laurie gave her, since they actually call it a leghorn later in the chapter, is most likely from the Georgian era, which would have been pre-Victorian era, so anything like pre-Queen Victoria's reign. So probably, during what we would call more the Regency era, or even a little bit before that, because they call it antique. And these were really wide brimmed hats with, deep crowns, kind of like our beach hats today.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine Jo wearing it too. And I love how in a little bit it says, she tied it down with a red ribbon, which is what they would do during the Georgian era. They'd run the ribbon over the top of the hat and down the side of the brim, and it would actually pull the brim a little bit over their ears and then tie it underneath their chin with a ribbon. And I can just see Jo doing that, and she doesn't care at all what she looks like.
Bless her. When I have read Little Woman more as an adult, I don't think Jo is that angry as she's portrayed to be, but I think it might be more to do with just her being a teenager, really.
The, different hormonal changes and the stresses of the time. Also, too, I think it has to do with like the strict Victorian morals of the time and the religious overtones of everything, and how that was, one of the cardinal sins. If you read other children's literature from the Victorian era, it's not uncommon to have similar things about, keeping your anger in check and not being angry. And yeah, compared to what we would consider anger today, it's not really what we would consider that angry.
Yeah, and Apollyon, that's a reference to Pilgrim's Process.
Yes.
Direct reference.
Yes, it is. I read it as a child, Pilgrim's Progress. In a big dashing hand, Laurie wrote, "Dear Jo, what hope. Some English girls and boys are coming to see me tomorrow, and I want to have a jolly time. If it's fine, I'm going to pitch my tent in Longmeadow and row up the whole crew to lunch and croquet, have a fire, make messes, gypsy fashion, and all sorts of larks. They are nice people and like such things. Brooke will go to keep us boys steady, and Kate Vaughn will play propriety for the girls. I want you all to come. Can't let Beth off at any price, and nobody shall worry her. Don't bother about rations. I'll see to that and everything else. Only do come, there's a good fellow. In a tearing hurry, yours ever, Laurie." "Here's richness," cried Jo, flying in to tell the news to Meg. "Of course we can go, Mother. It will be such a help to Laurie, for I can row, and Meg see to the lunch, and the children be useful in some way." "I hope the Vaughns are not fine grown-up people. Do you know anything about them, Jo?" asked Meg. "Only that there are 4 of them. Kate is older than you, Fred and Frank twins about my age, a little girl, Grace, who is 9 or 10. Laurie knew them abroad and liked the boys. I fancied from the way he primmed up his mouth in speaking of her that he didn't admire Kate much. I'm so glad my French print is cleaning. It's just the thing, and so becoming," observed Meg complacently. "Have you anything decent, Jo?" scarlet and gray boating suit. Good enough for me. I shall row and tramp about, so I don't want any starch to think of. You'll come, Bethy, if you won't let any of the boys talk to me. Not a boy. So here the girls talk about their dresses that they're going to wear for this outing. And of course, I love the contrast set up here too by the dresses that they choose. It just helps kind of build the contrast between Meg and Jo as characters and as sisters. But so a French prince obviously would have been like the edge of fashion because France was the center of fashion then as it is now. At the time, many of the French prints were floral motifs. So it probably was a floral motif and it would have been roller printed to be able to achieve that floral motif on the fabric. As far as like what her actual dress would have looked like other than just, the basic hourglass two-piece that we know of, I don't have a lot of other hints from this, but I do know two things. One, there's a French fashion plate from the era that shows 3 women and a man in a boat. And all 3 of the women wear these light colored pastel dresses that have little bitty print on them. And so I'm, think it's somewhat safe to assume that Meg's dress could have been similar to that, something very delicate and light colored. Also at the time, a sheer dress was popular. So this was like a really lightweight cotton fabric, usually that was see-through. And what they would do was they would line most of the bodice, but they would line it a little bit lower. The neckline was a little bit lower for the lining than the actual dress. So you could see a little bit of their neck area through the fabric. Sometimes the sleeves were lined with a short sleeve and sometimes they weren't lined. And so that way it was just a little bit cooler to wear because you had that thinner fabric and the breeze could kind of come through, those areas that weren't lined and keep them cooler, which I have a sheer dress. I actually did that one inspired by Beth a little bit later in the book when Jo and Beth go to the beach or to the seaside. So, but of course, that's in stark contrast to what Jo is wearing. Jo's wearing a scarlet and gray boating suit. So anything but pastel, obviously. Boating suits were considered sporting fashion, and throughout the Victorian era, sporting fashion was kind of on the rise for women because in the 1850s, Amelia Bloomer and some other women were advocate for women's rights, and Amelia Bloomer debuted the reform dress and her two-piece outfit. It was bloomers, and then which were ankle length, like they still didn't show anything and they were very loose, and then a shortened version of the dress that would hit around the knees. And they would use that for things like gymnastics. And you also see it carry over into the swimming fashions or the bathing fashions of the time. A boating suit would have looked somewhat similar to a lot of the other dresses. But once again, the trims and things would have been different. It would have been simpler trims, most likely. And a lot of times they were nautically inspired trims. So it might have taken inspiration from, men's sailor suits of the time, with some of the trim square around the shoulders.
I saw the boating dress you made on your Instagram. It was really pretty.
Yes, I did make one inspired by this. It's scarlet and gray, just like it said it. And there are several fashion plates and originals that survive from that era that I took inspiration from.
I don't think they really adapt this chapter a lot. Like only one I can think of, 2017 probably did it the best. I can only remember Meg's dress from that. Like she had this flower print dress.
Yes.
Yeah. It's been a while since I saw it.
Yeah, 2017 is actually my favorite.
It's a good one.
Of Little Women. Yeah, it's one of my favorites for sure. Another thing that Jo could have done, we don't know this for sure because there's nothing in the chapter to refer to this, but we do know they were going to play croquet. And during that era, croquet was also like on the rise as a sport for women to be involved in. And they would do something called a skirt lifter or a dress elevator, is what one of the magazines actually called it. And what it was it was a belt that ran around your waist, and then it had tapes that came down at intervals all the way around your skirt, usually about 6 tapes. And each tape ended with a loop on the end, and you would take your skirt and put it through that loop. And so then it would pull your skirt up, make it a little bit shorter, and it would create kind of a scallop effect around the bottom of your skirt. And if you look at fashion plates from this era, or even some of the photographs of people playing croquet, you can see that with the women's skirts. They have that scallop effect around the bottom. And then you would see the petticoats underneath. But the whole purpose was to kind of get it out of the way so that women could play croquet. They could see their croquet mallet, they could see the ball, and they could actually compete.
That's handy.
So I find it very plausible to believe that Jo might have worn something, because we know a little bit later in the chapter she was competitive when it came to playing croquet.
I like to please Laurie, and I am not afraid of Mr. Brooke. He is so kind, but I don't want to play or sing or say anything. I'll work hard and not trouble anyone, and you'll take care of me, Jo, so I'll go. That's my good girl. You do try to fight off your shyness, and I love you for it. Fighting faults isn't easy, as I know, and a cheery word kind of gives a lift. Thank you, Mother. And Jo gave the thin cheek a grateful kiss, more precious to Miss March than if it had given back the rosy roundness of her youth. I had a box of chocolate drops and the picture I wanted to copy, said Amy, showing her mail. And I got a note from Mr. Lawrence asking me to come over and play to him tonight before the lamps are lighted. And I shall go, added Beth, whose friendship with the old gentleman prospered finely. Now let's fly round and do double duty today, so that we can play tomorrow with 3 minds, said Jo, preparing to replace her pen with a broom. When the sun peeped into the girls' room early next morning to promise them a fine day, he saw a comical sight. Each had made such preparation for the fete as seemed necessary and proper. Meg had an extra row of little curl papers across her forehead. Jo had copiously anointed her afflicted face with a cold cream. Beth had taken Joanna to bed with her to atone for the approaching separation, and Amy capped the climax by putting clothespin on her nose to uplift the offending feature. It was one of the kind artists used to hold the paper on their drawing boards, therefore quite appropriate and effective for the purpose to which it was now put. This funny spectacle appeared to amuse the son, for he burst out with such radiance that Jo woke up and roused all her sisters by a hearty laugh at Amy's ornament. Sunshine and laughter were good omens for a pleasure party, and soon a lively bustle began in both houses. Beth, who was ready first, kept reporting what went on next door, and enlivened her sister's toilets by frequent telegrams from the window. There goes the man with the tent. I see Miss Barker doing up the lunch in a hamper and a great basket. Now Mr. Lawrence is looking up at the sky and the weathercock. I wish he could go too. There's Laurie, looking like a sailor. Nice boy. Oh, mercy me. Here's a carriage full of people, a tall lady, a little girl, and 2 dreadful boys. One is lame. He's got a crutch. Laurie didn't tell us that. Be quick, girls. It's getting late. Why, there is Ned Moffat. I do declare. Look, Meg. Isn't that the man who bowed to you one day when we were shopping? So it is. How queer that he should come. I thought he was at the mountains. There is Sally. I'm glad she got back in time. Am I all right, Jo? Cried Meg in a flutter.
So it talks about how the sisters were doing their toilets, which of course means they're just getting ready for the day. And so I just thought this was a good place to kind of talk about like what that would have looked like as far as the undergarments they would have worn and their hairstyles and everything. So they would have started by putting on chemises and drawers. So a chemise was like a loose, we would kind of think of it as a nightgown, like a short nightgown now, but it's just a loose part that came down around to the thighs, maybe to the knees at the longest. And this was put on as the bottom layer because it was what was washed all the time. So all of the sweat and the body oils would go onto your chemise, and then you wouldn't have to wash your outer clothes as often because that would absorb all of it. And so you would put on your chemise and then your drawers. And then on top of that, you would put your corset on. And contrary to popular myth that still persists today, the girls would not have been tight lacing. they would have just been wearing it like we wear a bra or other our undergarments today. It was just the supportive fashion of the day. And to be honest, having worn 1860s corsets myself, they are very comfortable. In some ways, I prefer them to modern undergarments, and they do not inhibit you from being able to do, everyday tasks. Movies and shows like to portray them as, instruments of torture and different things like that, but they really weren't in most cases. On top of that, they will put a corset cover because sometimes the lines of the corset might show through your dress bodice, depending, not like show through where you could see them, but it might create kind of like a bump or whatever. And so you put a corset cover on top of that to smooth out your lines. And a petticoat, you would wear a petticoat underneath your crinoline, just in case your skirt kind of came up a little bit when you were doing croquet or getting in and out of the boat or whatever. And then you would put on your crinoline and then at least one more petticoat on top of the crinoline because you needed that petticoat to smooth out the wires or the metal that was used to create the crinoline shape. So that is what their undergarments would have looked like. And then they would have put their dresses on top of that. The older girls, of course, would have been wearing the two-piece style, with the bodice and the very full skirt. The hairstyles would have featured a low bun at the nape of the neck. And so you could braid your hair back. I think it talks about Meg pinning up a braid and Joe's braid at one point, even in the book. And then you parted it in the center front and then combed down those front pieces smoothly over your ears and into your bun. And people like Meg, as we see, would, do little curls in the front to add a little bit of interest in different things. And later on, not at this part in the book, but later in the book, like as you get into the later 1860s and even move into the 1870s, which is very later in the series, there was much more ornate hairstyles, like curls. And so Amy, as Amy's coming of age, her hairstyles would have been much more ornate than the girls are at this point.
Yeah, I think the stereotype of the tight corset probably comes from 17th century, during the time when those were very fashionable in France.
That is a possibility, definitely, that's where it comes from.
Then they were made from whale bones.
Yeah, well, they still would have been whalebone in the 1860s. That's before it was outlawed. And so they would have still been using whalebone for their corsets in the 1860s as well. Of course, it's outlawed now, so we use what's called synthetic whalebone, which is just a plastic to bone them today, or you can use metal boning for them.
But it's interesting how that stereotype has stuck so long, because I have also worn corsets and they're not tight, really. And they usually give you a good poster.
Mm-hmm. They do. They do, and they take the weight off of your shoulders.
Oh, yeah.
Our bras, they put all the weight on your shoulders with the straps, and with a corset, all the weight sits on your hips. And so it's completely different the way the whole thing is set up.
When I lived in the UK, I had a friend who always dressed up in 1940s style. She did historical costuming also. She got me to wear corsets as well.
Even into, you mentioned the 1940s, even into the 1940s and the 1950s, they were still wearing undergarments that covered more of the body. You had the girdles and different things, and that's what women wore. And, all of these things where people are like, oh, they were so much thinner back then or whatever, is not necessarily true, because what they would do is they would use those undergarments to create their shape. So a key example of this, or a prime example of this, is the fact that I gained weight since COVID hit, right? But I can still fit into my 1860s dresses because the corset creates that shape. And I'm not tight lacing. It's just that a corset will kind of squish you into that shape. And so if you have a little bit more squish because you gained a little bit more weight, it just kind of squishes you back into that hourglass shape, and you can still fit into the same dress. It's a myth that people were so skinny back then too.
It's magic. Oh, how did you get into historical costuming?
I always loved the fashions of the 1860s. I think that was mostly because I loved Little Women, and I loved looking at the illustrations in the books and all of that. And I actually did not watch the movie versions until I was quite a bit older, because my parents were, as I mentioned, very religious. And so we were actually not allowed to watch movies growing up. And so all of everything I saw came through pictures and then what I imagined from reading the books. And so I fell in love with the silhouette of the 1860s, probably just because I loved Little Women so much. And I had always played around with, making some costumes and doing a little bit of Renaissance fair stuff here and there. But then about 2018, 2019 is when I really started exploring it and being like, okay, I want to see what it takes to really make historically accurate outfit as to what Jo March would have worn, for example, at the time, and started going down the whole research rabbit hole and sewing. I've been sewing for over 30 years. I started sewing as a girl in elementary school. And so I translated those skills into sewing historical things. And there's just, so much out there that people have put out there as far as like YouTube channels and blogs and different things. And then I think I mentioned this to you. I use a lot of books. I have a couple shelves full of books that show different costuming and different things throughout the era. And so just all of that research, I went down that whole rabbit hole and started developing the patterns. And then we have a local costuming group here in the Dallas area. And so I joined that and have a reason to actually wear my stuff out other than just for pictures and videos.
Oh, yeah. Where I live, we have like a medieval society. That's, I think, is the closest I could get, like costume cosplay. I should go to England or somewhere where they have those Shane House meetups where people dress up.
Yes. One of these days, I'm going to go over to the UK for one of those. I just haven't made it yet. But last year, I went to Louisa May Alcott's house, Orchard House. And while I was there, I had recreated her dress seen in her 1872 portrait. And so I had a local photographer come and take photos of me in front of Alcott's house. So I'm not allowed to take photos inside, but you can visit the grounds anytime you want, day or night. And so we just, picked a good time for photography and did photos outside. And that was a lot of fun to get to do that at her actual house. So
that sounds nice. And I would like to go to Prince Edward Island and do Anne of Green Gables, stuff like that, and dress up.
Absolutely. That's also on my list.
Oh, yeah.
Alcott was the first one I did, but I still have, Prince Edward Island and then Jane Austen in the UK. Those are still on my list to do.
Ned Moffat. He was in the Vanity Fair trying to flirt with Meg, I think.
Yes.
Yes. And now she's a bit worried that he's coming.
A regular daisy. Hold up your dress and put your hat straight. It looks sentimental tipped that way and will fly off at the first puff. Now then, come on. Oh, Jo, you're not going to wear that awful hat. It's too absurd. You shall not make a guy of yourself, remonstrated Meg, as Jo tied down with a red ribbon the broad-brimmed old-fashioned leghorn Laurie had sent for a joke. And just a short note here, I love how Alcott once again sets up the contrast between the two sisters just through their hats right here. It's pretty interesting how she characterizes both of them. I just will, though, for its capital. So shady, light, and big. It will make fun, and I don't mind being a guy if I'm comfortable. With that, Jo marched straight away, and the rest followed, a bright little band of sisters, all looking their best in summer suits with happy faces under the jaunty hat brims. The summer suits, one of the chores of women or the duties of women during that era was to refresh their household wardrobes for each season. And it's really interesting because if you look up the Delineator, which came out later in the Victorian era, but it was a women's magazine. It was more in the 1880s and the 1890s, if I remember the dates correctly. But every season, they would publish an article telling women how to outfit their entire family for the next season. So if you find one of those articles, like you can go to archive.org and look up Delineator copies, you can read, okay, this is what the husband should have for summer wear, and this is what the wife needs to have for summer wear, and this is what the 14-year-old daughter should have for summer wear, and this is what your 12-year-old schoolboy should have for summer wear, and this is what your 2-year-old should wear for summer wear. And it's really interesting. Sometimes it meant making completely new clothes, but a lot of times it also just meant reworking previously worn clothes to fit the fashions of that summer, right? And unlike us and our fast fashion today, they didn't have nearly as many outfits. And so they had, a limited amount of outfits and they each had a specific role, like we've been talking about. You had your your morning gown in Meg's case, in your French print, or in Joe's case, you had your boating suit, and then you would have had, your work dresses. And for kids going to school like Amy, you had your school frock. In this case, the summer suits the girls were wearing were probably light in color. They would, of course, been made of natural fibers. So things like linens and cottons and even wools. Wool, surprisingly, is very good in heat because it wicks away sweat. And so, their suits could have even been made out of a lightweight wool. And then, of course, we talked about, the sheer dresses that were popular. And the way they would have changed the look of each dress is through the trims, kind of like we talked about before, adding more trims or less trims, changing your sleeve shapes, changing your necklines. Like we talked about the morning gown versus a gown that you would wear out. Kind of like they mentioned with Laurie wearing his sailor suit. Sailor suit fashions were very popular, especially for children. So Amy could have been wearing a dress that had sailor suit type of trimmings too as well.
During this time, people took better care of their clothes than nowadays.
Yes.
Because you didn't have so many, and you need to look after them.
Well, definitely. And I mean, especially with the Victorian and the crinoline fashions, like the amount of yardage it took to make these dresses was a lot of yardage. We see that when Meg, after she's married and she buys that silk fabric when she's out with Sally, talks about how many yards it is. And so it took a lot of yardage. And that's also why the bodices and skirts weren't always attached, or usually they weren't attached. They didn't just mix match like a bodice with a skirt. Like you don't really see them putting like a plaid bodice with a solid skirt or vice versa. But they would instead buy enough of the fabric to make, say, 2 different bodices in the same fabric. And one of them might be for, afternoon gown when they would go visiting and paying calls. And then one bodice might be a ball gown bodice, and they could wear the same skirt with both of those bodices. Or also skirt and shirtwaist started to come into being in this era. And so they would have, an early version of what we would call a blouse now. And then they would pair it with one of their colored skirts. And the blouses were usually solid colors, usually black, a red, or a white. And so then they could pair it with any skirt that would coordinate with those colors. And that helped them kind of stretch their wardrobe and their outfits.
Tiffany and I continue our chat next time. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye.